Chang. I know a lot of you, for those of you who don't know, head of the Academy for Innovation Entrepreneurship. We got Steve Blank and Jerry Engel. They're partners in crime in teaching Lean Launchpad to educators, to students, all around the world. And so we're going to start off the discussion, just very interactive, but we will have time for some questions from the group. And so we'll start things off. Actually, as Bay Area natives, they are very familiar with startups. I want to say really quick how Startup Show started, just for some background. Steve and Jerry.
Yeah, so Startup Show started, a group of students came up to Dean Shane and Craig Dye, who directs this building, and said, hey, we want to work on some projects, but we don't want to work them in our dorm room, we'd like to work on them somewhere on campus. And so this used to be, there used to be a wall here, and this was a storage room with a bunch of cubicles and all these like broken equipment basically, and so cleared that out, put desks in here that we found and chairs that we scrapped, and then started just working on projects. And that organically developed 2 years later to what you see today, which is 80 current students and about 41 alumni who have passed through the space over the course of 2 years, which is awesome. So it just is indicative of the huge entrepreneurial community here on campus that's really born from all across campus. It's interdisciplinary, and we're really excited to be able to host such great, innovative thinkers.
So I thought if you wouldn't mind, maybe you can do your just a little bit of background for those who are not familiar with it, or maybe just show of hands who's not familiar with Lean Launchpad, Lean Startup.
Who, if I call on, can explain Lean Startup?
That's a good way to it, yeah.
Who could explain? See.
So maybe you can get a little some perspective of how that evolved. I mean, a lot of people may be reading about it today, but they don't know how it evolved over 8 companies. You know, maybe a little bit of that.
So, believe it or not, people did startups before you were born. I know that's kind of hard to think about, but it's like thinking about your parents having sex or something. I mean, it's just like some bizarre thought you don't even want to get your mind around. But in the 20th century, people actually did startups in a very different way than you guys will. It used to be, and this is a big idea, is that startups were thought of as nothing more than smaller versions of large companies. That is, everything a large company did, investors told you to do. Large companies like wrote business plans, 45 pages, 5-year forecasts, that's what they told you to do. Large companies, you know, executed that plan and fired executives if they didn't succeed at every step because it said so in the plan. That's what they did. Large companies hired sales, marketing, business development, engineering. Their org charts looked like small versions of large companies. We did that for 50 years in Silicon Valley until we finally figured out that wasn't kind of wrong, it was very wrong. And the big wrong part is that large companies execute known business models. That is, it's a fancy way for saying large companies, because they're large, figured out who their customers were and who competitors were and how to price and how to engineer products. But actually at startups, all you have are a series of untested hypotheses. And I use that fancy phrase because you or your parents are paying a lot for tuition here. What it really means is you're just guessing. It's a big idea. In a startup, having a series of untested hypotheses means instead of executing, you're actually searching for a business model. Even though you all think you understand on day one what you're doing, and you all think you're visionaries, the data actually says that you're hallucinating. It really is true. We know most of you are just fundamentally wrong. Maybe not about the technology, or maybe not about the customer, or maybe not about partners, but the odds of you nailing all parts of that business model on day one, almost zero. But even if I would have told you that 10 years ago, there were no tools or techniques or technology to kind of do that. And what we invented over the last 10 years, and it was Jerry Engel ran the entrepreneurship group at Berkeley who invited me to teach I had done 8 startups in 21 years. 4 IPOs, blah, 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 but I had retired. And in fact, I knew Dean when I was, I think my last startup where we met years when we were both young and, you know, I was Chinese and Dean was a white guy. I mean, that's how long ago it was. Right? I mean, it's just a long time ago. But since then, we kind of now know this thing which is called a lean startup. Lean startup is the first kind of tool set for entrepreneurs that are very different than what we do in large companies. And here's how it goes. The first thing we know is that if you're an entrepreneur, and how many of you are technology entrepreneurs that has come from the tech side? Every tech entrepreneur, including me, when I was a tech entrepreneur, hey, it's all about the technology. This other stuff we'll hire people to go do. Turns out that's not the case at all. Your idea, your technical insight, is only a small piece of what makes up a company. If you're an engineer or a technologist, that's like a hard idea to grasp. That's sales, that's marketing, they'll figure it out. Turns out that's why you're going to be out of business. What you really need to understand is what are all your guesses or hypotheses about the rest of your business? What are the hypotheses? Who are your customers? How are you going to get the product from you to the customer, your channel? How are you going to create end-user demand, customer relationships? You know, how much revenue are you going to get, and what's the revenue model? License, subscription, direct sales, etc. And then how are you going to price it? What are the costs? Any partners? Do you need resources or activities? Those pieces are all the hypotheses you have about your business. And we use something called the business model canvas to frame those hypotheses. That was done by a guy named Alexander Osterwalder. And if you want to be a real entrepreneur, you need to have his book on your shelf, at least to tell people you read it, if not actually reading it. And the good news is you don't even have to read it. It's a whole set of pictures. Don't like stuff I write, which has a lot of words. His is pictures, and you can get the entire book in one picture, called the Business Model Canvas. And what the business model does is allow you to simply visually put together the 9 key hypotheses or guesses about your business. The second piece of the lean startup says after you do that, then you run into the stuff I invented, which is called customer development. And customer development starts from a very simple premise. It says there are no facts inside your building, so get the hell outside. That's a big, profound idea, even though it sounds stupidly cute. It says, let's agree you're the smartest person in your building. And by definition, if you're a founder, you should think that way. Because if you're not, then we have different problems. But there is no way that you could be smarter than the collective intelligence of your potential customers. Compute on that for a while. It's another big idea. So therefore, the facts about your business model are outside your building. And therefore, there's a formal process called customer development, which will have you discover whether your hypotheses are incorrect or correct by validating and invalidating them. And the third piece, which comes from one of my students named Eric Ries. Eric Ries became the first practitioner of customer development when I sat on his board and funded his company. And his insight was, Steve, in the 21st century, we don't do waterfall engineering, we do agile engineering and agile development. So why don't we build these things called minimum viable products? And so while we're getting out talking to people, why don't we iteratively and incrementally build the product so we can actually get feedback on the physical instances of what we're learning? So the Lean Startup has 3 pieces: business model design, customer development, and agile engineering. That's the theory. In practice, at Stanford, at Berkeley, now through the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, Department of Energy, we teach it as a class called the Lean Launchpad, I think taught here at U of M, and also through the government called the I-Corps. So that's, what was your question?
Refer to the book, that's a good segue. So you can read these books, and so the people probably read the books and think that they're practicing Lean Startup. So you two are now teaching Lean Startup. What are the biggest disconnects between people who read the book, think they're doing it, and teaching it?
Sure.
Well, the biggest disconnect are people who think that a startup is a romance of a lifestyle. And, it's just a day of hard work. And it's a lot of being told no, it's a lot of realizing you're wrong, it's a lot of changing your direction. And we have a popular disconnect with entrepreneurship in general, which is that, it's some sort of cool thing. And it certainly is cool. We spend our lives in it, and it's by choice. But what's cool about it is when you come out the other side. You know, the challenge, the road, pivots, and the realization. So, you know, confusing the movie with the reality.
So, you know, let me just pile on what Jerry just said. So unlike almost anything else you've ever done, a startup is not a job. It's a calling. It's a big idea. It's not a job. Don't do this if you think it's cool because your roommates are doing it or it's, you know, the like neat thing on campus. You know, it's a calling like being an artist. Anybody a painter or musician or anybody else?
There's one. There's another. Good.
Right.
People are being shy.
People don't become painters or writers or composers or musicians because the pay scale. It's a big idea. You do it because there's something inside of you that needs to come out. If you're going to be a founder of a company, you better have that feeling or you better be working for someone else. That's in fact, a startup founder is the world's shittiest job. No, you will be the CEO when your co-founder quits, when your largest customer pulls the order the day before your money was going to run out, the toilets stop up and you realize you're the facilities manager, and all that will happen in the span of about an hour and a half. Okay? If you're not prepared to power through that, because it's your vision of making this happen regardless, you're better off taking a job where you get a paycheck and get to go home. You never get to go home as a founder. And if you not, like, if that doesn't excite you and it scares you, it's okay, you're normal. Crazy people found companies. Much like artists, painters, composers, etc. It is not a job. That was, Jerry said it much more succinct.
Go ahead.
Steve, tell me about building a business and design. I mean, just tell me, is this a process, you know, where we can image the business, we design the business, or is it something where you see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, so, you know, founders start off with a vision which almost always turns out to be a hallucination, but it's that vision that drives you and the passion that drives you. What we now have is a process with a lean startup and this methodology to be more efficient on how we search that space. Historically, you know, entrepreneurship and doing any kind of startup for you computer science folks, this is an NP complete process. We now have a bounding box around it that at least makes it an NP process, meaning, you know, still computationally hard, but it allows you not to go off in every possible direction. Is that the question?
Yeah, and well, that's the answer. This challenge of trying to, we heard that today. So, you know, today we had presentations from how many teams?
20 teams.
20 teams, and these were solid players. These are guys who had already raised NSF funding, NIH funding, right? They had SBIR financing. They were rocking and rolling before they met us. And then they met us and found out, whoa, maybe they don't know where they're headed. And to hear guys who were really on their way to somewhere realize that they didn't know where they were headed, and that the NP complete versus the NP problem was really helpful to them. There was a repeatable process where they could do a discovery without panicking because they were being led through a process. And that was a big message to get across today.
So you talked a little bit about how being a founder is, you don't do it for the money, you don't do it to make a movie about, have a movie made about yourself. Before your 8 startups, you had a pretty eclectic life in the military, working with nuclear reactors, and what kind of drew you to startups?
Gee, you know, crazy was my middle name. It was, I couldn't imagine that you got paid to go do this. You know, one of the other, you hear all these characteristics about what it takes to be a great entrepreneur: resilient, tenacious, agile, you know, driven, etc. That should be on your checklist. For me, I now look for one other, because in hindsight, that was also on my list, which was curious. And I was curious about stuff way past my expertise, which really wasn't much, but I was curious about everything. And so being able to get a job in a startup, from supercomputers to semiconductors to military intelligence to video games, and people give you millions or tens of millions of dollars to go do that, it's the craziest thing I ever heard. But very quickly, you got to become a domain expert. So I just thought it was the world's best place, the world's best time. And back when I was an entrepreneur, there was only one physical place, maybe two, but certainly Silicon Valley was the physical place where the money and the expertise was. And now that's no longer true. The expertise is here and everywhere else. You guys, literally, by going on the net for an hour, could learn more about entrepreneurship that the sum of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs knew when I started or Jerry started. It's all there. In fact, the biggest problem now is you to have some kind of compass or guidepost on how to sort through all the contradictory advice you will get, because you could get advice that tells you what to do almost everything. Without having some kind of theory or gut feel, you're going to get completely spun around. That's when I was an entrepreneur, the amount of data you could get was limited by your ability to intake caffeine on a daily basis, because data was communicated via coffee. You would have coffee with somebody, they would teach you something, then you had to have another coffee. I was having 5 or 6 coffees a day. No wonder I was wired for 21 years.
So you kind of alluded to this, how Silicon Valley obviously used to be, or still is, sort of known for startups, but particularly for student startups, software and web, the process works just, is that particularly well suited for students? Maybe that's a better way of asking it, in software, to get a few iterations of customer development under their belt while they're still in school?
Sure, but I'll go back to while in school, you can decide that it's practice, but the reality is when you actually encounter what it is for real. And what it is for real is it's all consuming 24/7. I won't say you stop going to classes, but that becomes your driver. Here, for the first time, you could get your hands in the game and talk to people who've been in the game and get a feeling of what it's like. And then you've got to decide whether you want to commit to this or get a job in it or do something else. I just want to emphasize, as a founder, this is not a hobby. Again, I'm going to use the analogy which some of you are going to start clicking on. It's like painting. Yeah, you could paint as a hobby, but when you decide to paint or dance or compose, it no longer becomes a hobby, it becomes all-consuming. If you tip into that, then you have tipped into it. You happen to be in the world's perfect place here of being able to, and I don't mean this as a pejorative, dabble by seeing, the tech and seeing what it feels like to do a startup, learning the process before you decide that this is kind of like what you want to dedicate at least some part of your life is. Let me tell you, you don't get to go home as a founder of a startup. You don't go home. It's with you 24/7. And if it's not, then you're not in the game. And it's okay, but just don't confuse what you're doing with what really gets done. Thank you.
Yeah. So you've now taught Lean Startup to students, to professors, to researchers, to entrepreneurs who have actually already started their companies. Any sort of things that you notice in the classes that you teach at Berkeley and Stanford for students versus some of these?
Well, so I was sitting here saying, okay, Steve's doing this great work, share with you, some methodology, and if I'm sitting in your shoes, I'm saying, okay, so how do I use the next 2 years, or year and a half, or 3 years, whatever you have in front of you? What's the best thing you can do relative to this content, right? You got to master some skills, right? You got to get your math, coding, whatever your art, whatever your base skills are. You want to get close to the best, right? The university brings you the best people. You want to get to know them. What is it like to work with geniuses, to work with really good people, so you can get the flavor for them, so you can hire them when you get out and do it on your own. The other thing you can do is you can't learn entrepreneurship, right? You can't, you read Steve's great book, you can take courses, but what you can do is learn what the key tools are that you can take with you and then pull out of your tool chest when you encounter the challenges. So what are the key tools? So I'd be out there sampling the way people think in different frameworks, different ways. For me, after 40 years in entrepreneurship, the Lean Launchpad methodology, the Lean Startup, if you will, in general, is a hugely valuable tool. So I invite you to taste it, play with it. Figure out what works for you, what tools work for you, and then put them in your kit bag, practice them, and move on to the next tool, and but don't forget the old one. And keep working those tools.
So, some of the startups that you were your 8 different startups. There were a lot of different industries. Today we're teaching in life sciences. Anywhere you think the methodology doesn't work as well. Not everybody here is doing software web startups, but just potholes to look for.
So that's a leading question, because in the 2 books I wrote, it said this whole lean methodology, business model, customer development, agile engineering, would work in everything but life sciences. Now, I hope you understand, we're now teaching this class for life sciences at the National Institute of Health, where they decided not only does it work in there, it actually works better in that domain than in almost any one. And so, to answer your question, I've yet to see an industry or market or technology where kind of these basic rules of frame your hypotheses, don't believe them, get out and actually test whether they're true or not, and do it by incrementally building your product in iterative steps. It's true for it's now say where I never would have said this before, it's true for everything. Hardware, software, medical devices, therapeutics, the last place we thought it would work, video games, everything.
So what does get out of the building mean?
Yeah, so get out of the building simply says, look, when you're building a product or an app or something, the first people who fall under your spell of your reality distortion field is this is the best thing that was ever built is you. And that's a problem. Because you tend to believe that how many of you are doing software and app? Come on. Right? It's real easy. How many of you are doing hardware? Okay? It's wow. Well, did they get the back of the room? How did that work? The hardware people can't sit up front? Is that I see. It's sometimes really seductive if you're the engineer to go, let me just add another feature. Right? Anybody, a couple of you are nodding or looking at each other. Right? It's easy to say, well, it doesn't have enough features, or the code's not done, or whatever. It turns out that's different from, am I actually doing an engineering project, or do I want to build a company? Because potential customers might not really care about what you're building. And there is no way you can pre-compute that. It's a big idea. You think you know, and that is the problem. This whole lean process says, why don't we just humor me, take all your hypotheses about how smart you are, about who the customers are and how much they're going to pay, and what features they want, just humor me. Let's go out and find the first 10 people who agree with you. Let's go out and go talk to them. Either show them a wireframe or even a PowerPoint slide or a physical styrofoam mock-up if it's cardboard, and just make sure that your view of the problem is the same as their view of the problem. If it is, then let's go see if your view of the solution is the same view as their view of the solution. I'd say about 98% of the time we find out you were just guessing and you were wrong. In the old days, meaning when Jerry and I did companies and even Dean, the result would be you're fired. Big idea. In the old days, when you were wrong about product or customers or sales, we would fire executives in companies. And that still happens in large companies. In startups, another key component of the lean startup is instead of declaring failure, meaning we fire you, we now say failure simply means we've invalidated some key hypotheses, and we call that a pivot. And a pivot is defined as a substantive change to one or more of the business model hypotheses. Wrong customer, or maybe wrong feature set, or maybe wrong pricing. And instead of panicking and firing people and running around crazy, we simply say, oh, we get it. Startups go from failure to failure, learning as rapidly as they can, burning the smallest amount of cash and time in the maximum amount of learning. Does that make sense?
You remind me of the example that your Udacity class about being wrong on pricing. There's a team that had a value proposition but asked the wrong questions and actually severely undercharged. You remember what that is?
No, but it happens. But if you're in, again, engineers tend to think that everything is value price, meaning how much did the components cost me? I'll charge 30% more. Well, it turns out, maybe that's not how the users value it. Maybe users value it 100x more. In my last company, funny story is the co-founder I found in a company called Silicon Graphics had built this piece of software. He was thinking maybe we could get $5 grand for. And the genius I said, no, let's start a company because I know we could get 50 grand. And the first salesman I hired from Oracle looked at that and said, Steve, you're out of your mind. This is enterprise software. We could get $500,000. Same software, but we're not done. And the company is like growing like this. We hired the chief operating officer of KPMG, the software systems integrator, said, what are you guys, crazy? We could be selling this for $5 million a pop. It was the same piece of software. 1,000x. Because we figured out how to value price it by describing it in different ways and adding other services around it. When I retired at 50, had an $8 billion market cap. So this was not theory, this was practice.
And then you similarly were involved with other companies where you didn't listen to the customer feedback. A computers company, Allen, right?
Well, there was a video game company called Rocket Science Games, which is my favorite failure. There used to be a magazine, it still is, I think, a Wired magazine. You ever see? I was on the cover. I was on the cover with this video game company. Imagine this with a baseball cap and a ponytail. I mean, that's already kind of weird. And I'm on the cover, new digital superstars, blah, blah, blah. And as I'm on the cover, about 90 days, the magazine, the ink is still wet, I realized we're going out of business. We're going out of business bad. And we're going out of business, I'm going to lose $35 million going out of business. And I managed to sell the company off for piece parts, but I called my mother, who's a Russian immigrant. My mother, after even 50 years in the country, English wasn't her first language. So everything was like simultaneous translation. You'd say something in her head, she'd have to pause and translate. I called her up, Mom, and how come you don't call, and the whole thing, and then I go, hey, I just thought I'd call you and let you know I lost $35 million. Silence, pause, translate. First words out of her mouth. Where'd you put it? I said, no, Mom. Well, I spent it, it's gone. Translate, pause, and then she's like, well, gee, there's nowhere else for us to go. The country we came from is gone. And then she thought about it some more and said, and her name's blank, we can't even change it. And I said, no, the reason I'm calling you is that the people who gave me that money now gave me another $12 million to do my next company. Then she broke into languages I didn't even know that existed, like some of them I recognized. And then eventually she said, only in America are the streets paved with gold. And the reason why I tell you this story is not a Steve story. It's in fact in entrepreneurial clusters, like in this room, this building, Silicon Valley, New York, etc. We have a special name for a failed entrepreneur. You know what it's called? You might know. Experience. It's a big idea. If you're in a place that values entrepreneurship, failure is not the end of your career. If it's an honest failure, you did your best, you didn't cheat anybody, you didn't run away with the money, etc. In an entrepreneurial cluster, that is where both finance people and the infrastructure get entrepreneurship, it's okay. And by the way, if you fail 3 or 4 times, the venture capitalists stop returning your calls, but no one's coming at. But if you failed once or twice, by the way, for that next company that the same VCs gave me $12 million, I returned $1 billion each to each of them, which kind of proved to them that failure is not the end of your career.
And about the time we met, you talked about Rocket Science Games as one of the companies,
right.
But you introduced our company, the company I was with a lot of the folks that you used to work at Rocket Science Games, and all of them were with startups within hours. And doing big stuff. Right? You were telling me the other day about some of this.
Right. So this is what makes startups tolerable in entrepreneurial clusters. It allows some of you who are thinking about, gee, will this screw up my job, career, whatever? How's it going to look on your resume? And the answer is pretty damn well, regardless of how it turns out. It's a big idea. That doesn't occur anywhere else in the world other than the United States and maybe some places in China and London, but not everywhere else. We now kind of get entrepreneurship. It's not quite a badge of honor every city, but in most places, certainly Silicon Valley, New York, the Washington area, having a startup failure is not the end of your career.
You're a great person to follow up on this because, so we're saying it's okay to fail, but that doesn't mean you should be coddled, right? And as our chief anti-coddler.
So what he's talking about is that when we do this national training through the National Science Foundation, we're out here at 30 or 40 campuses really promulgating a methodology with very experienced people, right? Experienced in their science. These are the world's best scientists funded by your government to do important work. And we give them very direct feedback, relentlessly direct. And
we hit him with a 2x4.
yeah,
So it's not
yeah, you take somebody who's got a PhD and has raised millions of dollars of research funding and is
tenured faculty.
Yeah, tenured faculty on their way to a Nobel Prize or something, and we say very direct things to them. And it's important, that honesty and that candor is an important skill for you. It'll be very helpful to you as an entrepreneur to learn how to talk to people and convey honest, direct information without a lot of emotion, without anger, but without weakness and without shyness. And being relentlessly honest and clear is an important skill. I offer that to you to take away.
Our most precious commodity is time. And if you think you're being nice by not wanting to hurt somebody's feelings, they may waste another month, another year, another several years, and lots of money because you didn't tell them what you honestly thought, that I wouldn't use this, or I don't think so.
You're actually putting them out of business.
Yeah.
So telling someone your baby's ugly is kind of hard. At least it would allow them to see if they were showing you the right end of the baby. For those of you who don't have children, just think about it.
I wanted to make sure, I see if Jeff, Mackenzie, if there's anything you want to chime in with, please do.
Hey, Dean,
Yeah.
let's ask these guys.
Now, open up to everybody.
Let's just open it up, okay?
Yeah.
Because you guys came out and we're here for you. So, what's on your mind?
So, I've been reading the books.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Rob. I'm about to graduate in a week and a couple days.
What's your major, Rob?
Entrepreneurship and innovation in STEM education.
STEM. Cool.
Made my own.
I got to say real quick that Rob and we were here until 9 o'clock the other night talking about how do we make everybody more curious. Following up on
Go for it, Rob.
So it seems like this methodology works really well for startups, for young businesses. It seems like there's some interest in applying it to other kinds of learning because it's the whole idea is that you learn really fast. You also have this advice that if you're not willing to commit 24 hours a day, you're going to be taking this home. If you don't want to be a startup founder, but you also are driven by curiosity and you want to learn really fast, does this apply to people who don't want to start businesses, but just
What do you
want to?
think, Steve?
What changes also?
Well, we're trying to learn that right now. We're applying this in a program called I4L, or I4 for Learning, to see how this methodology can apply to STEM education.
Sure, and in fact, I'm going to take this in a slightly different place. We'll see if it goes anywhere near your question. Anybody ever hear of design thinking? You guys teach design thinking? Anybody know how that's different than customer development? So, by the way, I invented one of them, and I couldn't explain it for a couple of years. So let me give you the difference and suggest that what you might actually be asking for is maybe I should be doing design thinking. So let me explain. Customer development, the part of the lean startup I invented, came from a very Silicon Valley place. In Silicon Valley, we tended, and still tend, to start companies based on a technology and product in hand. I invented a faster X, or I have a semiconductor, or I have a video game, etc. And even worse, I just convinced some investors, whether they were angels or venture capitalists, to give me a couple $1 million, and now the clock is ticking. What clock is ticking? Was a founder, in that case, you only know 3 numbers. You know your burn rate, how much money you're spending per month. You know how much money is left in the bank, and you know the exact day, hour, and minute it goes to 0. You go to bed thinking that, you dream about that, and you wake up thinking about that. Everything else happens in between. Therefore, the customer development process is driven by urgency. And certain things happen when your urgency, including what I call good enough decision making. Turns out in a startup, I only believe there are two types of decisions. Revocable decisions, ones you could roll back, and irrevocable decisions. So a sense of urgency means when you have a meeting in a startup and you're sitting in that meeting and it's a revocable decision, great, meeting's over, we're making the decision. There is no other meeting. Why? Because like in another week or month, if we're wrong, we can roll it back, but we're moving forward. Irrevocable, you know, how much the company we give investors, we sign a 10-year lease, those are pretty irrevocable, at least for an early stage company. So number one, you're product driven and customer development. Number two, urgency, which means speed, speed, speed. Make sense for customer development? Design thinking comes from a very different spot, but the tools tactically out of the building feel a lot like customer development. But design thinking says, I don't know what product I have at hand, but I kind of am interested in this space. I know these customers or this area is a place where I want to solve a problem. And so I'll do something called needs finding, which looks like a lot like customer discovery, and it's not a fault of design thinking, it's just how it was built. There's no urgency built into the process. That is because it came from IDEO, is working with Procter & Gamble, and you had years, and you didn't lose your corner office if the project didn't work out. It's not that you can't build urgency into design thinking, it's just that it's not there. So you might be asking, can I actually sit in an incubator and think about, use a design thinking methodology to iterate needs finding to build prototypes to see with no pressure at all whether these fit? And so when somebody wants to explore this space, I kind of say, oh, you actually want a similar but not quite same methodology called design thinking. Does that make sense? By the way, there is no right process. It's not like one is right and the other is wrong. There's the process that applies for the situation you're in. And why I tell you the story is, it sounds like design thinking might actually be more suited to the things you want to explore, which is, gee, I don't want to have a gun to my head. I am interested in this area. I do want to get out of the building and talk to people. Does that help maybe or not? Or did I answer a question you didn't even ask?
Answered a great question.
But not the one you asked.
Yeah, I'm wondering,
you got to ask one more.
Thank you. I'm wondering if, you know, given those two mindsets, those two tools, and maybe other tools, if those are broadly applicable to any questions, any curiosity that anyone might have.
My opinion is they cover a lot of ground, right? One just comes from an urgency. You know, I have a finite amount of time and cash and a product at hand. That is, if you think about it in a business model parlance, I'm starting with a value problem, looking for the customer segment for product market fit. With design thinking, I'm starting with the customer segment, trying to, you know, do prototyping to figure out what value problem fit. That kind of covers like a lot of the ground. There might be some other tools, and as I remind everybody, we're just at the beginning of inventing the stack. Maybe one of you will be inventing a better tool that kind of solves a more broader problem. Other questions? Go for it.
Hi, my name is Mike Mandel, senior economics major here at the University of Maryland. First off, I wanted to thank both of you guys for coming and the trip out over Maryland. It's much appreciated. Personally, I can't speak for everyone. I'm personally getting mine out of this. My question is, say you're able to prove your business concepts with, you know, a methodology of any type. How do you make the transition from, you know, taking this idea and making a business model out of it?
And putting it to work? Yeah, that's a great question. How many of you think you'd have difficulty making that decision, when to pull the trigger? You got the insight, you've done validation, and now you're going to wonder about whether to go forward or not. How many are going to wonder for a while? Okay.
You're not.
Yeah, if you're going to wonder about pulling that trigger, I don't think you should pull the trigger. Just because it is a leap of faith. And if you have second guess, I mean, there are lots of reasons to have doubt, but and there's lots to wonder about. But it is going to be a leap of faith, and it takes momentum to get across that path.
And let me just give another maybe view is that when I was an entrepreneur, I spent the first 10 or so years apprenticing. As I didn't even understand what startup was. I was just in them. I didn't even know where the hell I was, except they kept giving you these pieces of paper called stock, and every 3 years I could buy a house. You know, I'm like, what the hell is this? And then I finally figured out that's not how normal people were actually working. But my point is that if you're kind of curious but don't want to be the founder, not most people are equipped to be a founder at 20-something. As I said, you got to be certifiably insane at that age, but good time to do it. But you also can actually decide if you're curious enough that you might want to be employee 100. And then in your next thing, you might want to be employee 20. And then maybe you want to be in the first 5 or 10, maybe not the first founder. And that's actually what I did with ever-increasing roles until I kind of got where I was and went, wait a minute, you know, I want to do this, and had enough skills and learned by apprenticeship. Does that? So,
Makes a lot of sense.
so it doesn't. So there isn't. When we talk about founders and you got to go do this out of college and whatever, that is one path. Which is, by the way, I'm just impressed for 20-some-odd-year-olds who could do that. I was in my 30s before I ever could imagine I had enough data. Now, the good news and bad news is you have much more data now than anybody in Silicon Valley ever did. You still don't have that experience, right? And so you might want to just kind of apprentice. Is that?
Yeah, right here.
Hi guys, my name's Hugh Monahan. I'm a junior here. So you guys are talking a lot about you know, making hypotheses, testing them, and then shifting your product or your strategy based on that. Can you kind of unpack the idea more as to whether the kernel of your idea is kind of on point and you might have to shift, or whether you should just throw it out the window, kind of just, you know, cut off ties with it because it's not going to work, and maybe if you have examples of when that's worked or when you've thrown something out and
So let me try and grab that question and take it in the direction, and then I'll come to the seat. I'm going to follow up. The question was sort of like, when do you know early on whether you got something worth working on? How many of us in the room think, I'm going to give you a binary choice. You're either going to be customer-centric, you know, more problem-centric, or you're going to be technology or solution insight-centric, all right? So how many of us are more customer-centric? Wow. How many of us are more technology or solution-centric? Interesting.
This is where that relentlessly direct honesty really helps pair some of you from the people who think you're customer-centric into the other category.
So, I mean, this is a tough one. I think this question that you're asking is easier, perhaps, actually, if you're technology-centric. Because you can be in love with something, an insight of technological capability, and want to chase that. That's not necessarily the right place or best place to start from, but I think it's easy to have a passion around that. You can have a passion customer-centric, but it can be more diffuse, you know, because it's like you get into discovery and it starts to waffle around on you. Who is the customer, and what exactly is the need? Am I solving world hunger, or am I selling Cheerios? You know, where do I want to approach this one? So, what do you advise young people when they got an idea and they don't know if it's worth the work to take to the next step?
Yeah. So I'll go second what Jerry said. You got to decide whether you have a product and service in mind, you're looking for customers, or you have this generic customer thing in mind, and then somehow you might invent the product. That latter is design thinking. It's a big idea. That's design thinking. Go do design thinking until you're tired. If you have a product, very quickly you could use lean startups to very narrowly focus that down in a short period of time. The problem is when you start with a customer need part, it's almost open-ended. I don't know how to put urgency into that problem. Does that make sense or not?
Yeah. Are there like specific like numbers or like someone might not be using your
What's your
product?
major?
Economics and technology.
Are you a quant or are you a historian? Sociologist?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't really know how to
Do you love numbers or do you love?
No, I mean, I get that part, but I mean, I guess I'm more social science.
Uh-huh.
Like, are there numbers or indicators where, like, someone might not be using your product or downloading your service, and that could be a whole range of reasons.
The
but
algorithm
can you narrow
you're
it down?
looking for is in God's hands. And if he went, or she, or it would share it with us, we'd all be billionaires. I don't think there's an answer to that one. I think there's an insight. What's an insight, Steve? You don't know? An insight, okay, what you're looking for is passion. What you're looking for is commitment. And that comes from insight. And insights are when you think and believe right here you know something. And you have a reason to believe that you know something. Then you can go out and try and validate that insight with more inquiry. You start with an insight, and you can't be, wondering what an insight is. You have to know what it is when you have it. In the back of the room, right there, blue shirt, tie. A tie! All right.
Which is really unusual for Jack.
And you should know you're not allowed in Silicon Valley with one.
I'm not allowed to hear this. Yeah, so my question is, how has the customer development model or any of the tangential concepts changed since they were developed?
Oh, that's a great story. So, the first piece that actually got built was this customer development methodology. I started writing, of all things, my memoirs when I retired, and realized two things. One is I'd have to pay my children to even read it. I was writing it as a book, but I was writing these things at the end called Lessons Learned, and realized that what I had just observed through my career was that every time I succeeded, and by then I was on public boards, private boards, every time there were successes, we were ignoring the, quote, common wisdom of the Silicon Valley investor pool. We were actually getting out of building and talking to customers, not executing some plan. And so I thought that there might be a new methodology and got invited to teach by this guy at Berkeley, and then talked him into allowing me to teach a new class called Customer Development. And then I invested in my ex-VP of Engineering, who had a young co-founder named Eric Reese. And this time, instead of funding his company just by writing checks, which I used to do, I said, look, I've written this new course called Customer Development. You and your young co-founder have to come and take it before I write you the check. And this guy named Will Harvey, who's very, very smart, would be driving with Eric to the class at Berkeley, just bitching that he had to do this to just get the money. And Eric would be saying, no, this is actually a great idea, blah, 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 blah. And Eric Reese became the first practitioner of customer development in the world, and it was his insight that added the second piece, which was, Steve, agile engineering is the perfect match to customer development. And so that was piece 2. And then about 3 or 4 years later, a guy named Alexander Osterwalder wrote his PhD thesis, which is probably the most downloaded thesis out there, but then turned it into a book called Business Model Generation, which gave us the third piece of the Lean Startup, which was the business model design. So the Lean Startup is now, at least is defined by me and the article I wrote which ended up on the cover of Harvard Business Review last May, is the stack of Osterwalder's business model canvas, my customer development process, and Eric Reese's understanding that agile engineering kind of helps you build what we call minimum viable products. Eric then wrote a book called The Lean Startup, which he became the Johnny Appleseed, meaning the proselytizer of the process, as a conference and whatever, and has done enormous help in proselytizing the process to entrepreneurs. And so Eric's been pushing it in startups. I've done some of that. I have a blog called steveblank.com. If those of you who haven't seen it, there's a tab on the top called Startup Tools. If anybody's building a startup, you have to look at that tab on that page. Every possible tool you will need is on that page. There's another tab that if you want to know how Silicon Valley actually happened, there's another tab called The Secret History of Silicon Valley. Click on that tab. But in any case, that's how it came about, and that's kind of the current state. Anybody in is it business school in here? Anybody in business school here?
Yes!
So it turns out that what's happened in the last, I'd say, only 2 years, is for the first time in the history of the modern corporation, large companies are now looking to startups for entrepreneurial and innovation tools. It's a big idea. Why? Because the 20th century, all the rules that we had built out of business schools, as business school's first business school class, Harvard 1908, basically existed to create masters of business administration. That is to create a cadre of workers who could administer and execute existing corporations. Those tools, tactics, strategies in the 20th century in business schools were not built to do startups, but to give managers great tools. That worked wonderfully when you could own a market segment for a decade, and Jack Welch and his rules all worked. Be number 1 and 2 in a market, blah, blah, blah. Turns out that everything you knew as an MBA in the 20th century is destructive to running a large corporation today. It turns out today in the 21st century, companies are facing what I call and others continuous disruption. China is a manufacturer, China Inc. Branding is no longer has the same power in the 21st century. The internet makes everything transparent. Cost of entry, for example, cost of entry of software business, 1,000x cheaper today than it was 15 years ago. So everything has changed, yet the tool set we have in large corporations almost look like the same in the 20th century. Large companies are very rapidly trying to figure out how to do what's called continuous innovation. And that's very hard for corporations that basically structured to be very efficient execution machines. I don't even know why I'm answering a question you didn't ask, but it's a key idea that innovation and entrepreneurship is not only for the engineers in hardware and software and life sciences, but actually has immediate impact now in large corporations. And that's where Jerry and I are spending some of our time as well, in working with the large companies and the government to figure out how to get this methodology to kind of speed up innovation.
And just put that another way, it's great that all of you are here in this room, but you're also kind of the most entrepreneurial set of students in this community. It's really why every single student needs to learn these entrepreneurial tools and mindsets, because even if they have no intention of joining a startup, that's what the large companies need.
Okay. So our belief, and we're working with a bunch of business schools, is ultimately the entrepreneurship group in a business school will be corporate lean startups. Meaning you will be teaching in business schools these tools and techniques, not for startups, but how to apply them inside of existing execution engines to have a large company be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. Because they're very different tools, they're very different processes and procedures and key performance indicators and incentive programs for innovation than there are for execution in a large corporation. Next question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Shanice Cosby, and I'm a communications major here and a minor in technology entrepreneurship. I currently own an online clothing boutique and we're launching next month. I have a business partner, and the crossroads I'm at right now is that I'm trying to create a culture that inspires and empowers women, but my business partner isn't seeing my idea. So do you think it's best that I just do the work and show her, or talk to her as I'm doing the work?
So you and your co-founder are not aligned? Is that the problem? I'm trying to understand what the question is. Step up.
She's my mother. So,
So you just violated fundamental rule 1, which is don't do startups with people you can't fire. No, seriously. And I don't mean for you, but in general, never do a startup with someone you're sleeping with or can't fire. Why? Because eventually you'll have to. Not sleep with them, but you will eventually. You eventually will have to fire them. And if you can't do that, you have a serious problem. And I'm not suggesting it, but you do have a problem, which you just kind of defined is, you know, like, how do you argue with your mother when you're not in a startup? I mean, it's even, so I don't know how to answer your question. Can you step up closer so we can hear you?
it's not really an argument as much as she just doesn't see my vision. And
That's an argument.
okay. I've been actively working and strategically posting on social media for the past 3 weeks, and the response that I've gotten has opened doors for our business. So now I bring it to my mother. I'm like, hey, look what I did, look what I did, look what I did. So should I just show her? Just do the work and show her the results.
Yeah, so I'm serious. So I'm going to give you just a rough heuristic, but somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of startups melt down before they ever get funded because of team alignment issues, which is a polite way of saying, you know, it's just not working. Because you need to be thinking the same way. And I don't mean thinking exactly, but how you solve problems, how you take in data, etc. In this case, it doesn't sound like, forget about the specifics, it doesn't sounded like you actually agreed on how do you learn new stuff in your startup. So is it your opinion versus hers, or have you, that is, have you agreed that if I show you data, then you will change your opinion? Or have you agreed when I find something new, you'll come out to outside the building with me and go see it? That is, you need some rules of engagement with co-founders, and I'm going to give you the equivalent story and not answer your specific question, because no one can answer your specific question. But when I was in my last company, I'd done this company with a co-founder I worked with in 2 other startups, VP of engineering, brilliant guy. And we had this deal that I would be out doing customer discovery, and when I found something interesting, I'd bring him out, because if it required to change or pivot in the product, you know, I was not going to have to like convince him. I was just going to show him the data. And so we had been calling on a company called Schwab, which was still is a stock company, talking to their data mining group, which is a whole bunch of PhDs, who kept asking for this feature called householding, which I kind of vaguely understood was important. And then, like, VP was trying to shake me and say, Steve, it's not kind of important, it's like essential. And, you know, I finally thought it was important enough to bring my co-founder, VP of engineering, who sits through the meeting at Schwab and listens to all the engineers making the case why our fundamental structures of our data warehouse didn't quite do this. And so we're driving back to our headquarters. And it's because I've been with this co-founder, I knew what the game was. He didn't say a word for the first 20 miles. You know, so we're in the car, we're driving from San Francisco to Palo Alto, we pass the airport, doesn't say anything, you know, past Redwood City, doesn't say anything, and this is like a game of chicken. And I always lose. And I finally said, Ben, what are we going to do about Schwab? He said, Steve, show him page 6 of the spec. And I said, Ben, the spec only has 5 pages. And he said, not anymore. This is where you laugh. The key point is, my co-founder company had already assumed that here was the new data and that we needed to change the system, and we were done with it. I had showed him some real customer input. My point is, we had already agreed what that relationship was. There was no argument that needed to be had, right? We had agreed if I had showed, it's not like me going into engineering and saying, I just spoke to this customer, we need 15 more features. He listened to the customer, realized it was a big enough account that was going to give us several $1 million, be a flagship account, and it wasn't just me going blah, 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 that there was a fundamental feature missing in our architecture that only he could fix, and he did. You don't have that relationship yet. You either need to have it or decide on some other relationship, because this will be the beginning of many of those discussions. Does that help?
Yeah, that really helps. Thanks.
So Steve and Jerry had to head up to Baltimore, so how about...
What's the best question?
Yeah, so we want to end on a good one. A lot of pressure.
I'm JT Stanley. Thank you guys for coming and everyone that made this possible. Let's say you're a startup. You have a disruptive product, and you can get it out to early adopters, but you're afraid there's going to be a big gap between now and early adopters and the future, and that's ahead of its time. What do you do in that situation? How do you look at it in perspective?
I'd go narrow. I would go very high price, very high margin to those people that are desperate for this innovation and try and survive by owning a niche, while you then show the rest of the world incrementally how valuable this capability was, and then go grow.
So I think to answer your question, I think for startups, one of the things you all need to remember is that the word startup is really misleading. There is at minimum 3 types of startups. You mentioned one of them. There's a startup that's entering an existing market. What do we know about an existing market? What do we know about an existing market? No. What do we know about an existing market?
Client base, customers.
Customers. We know about customers, right? Why do we know that? It exists. What else do we know about it? What can we go out and ask in an existing market? I'm sorry?
What they like.
What they like. They can tell us what features they need. What else can they tell us?
What they need.
What do they pay? What do they need? What else can we find out about an existing market? Competitors. We can find out, oh, look, competitors, here's what else can we know? Market size, right? In the existing market, you could go out and do customer discovery, figure out like what customers will need, they'll tell you, and you can enter that market. By the way, on day one, your revenue better look like this. You better be right about that feature set because you're taking market share. There's another type of an existing market where the incumbents, that is the competitors, are too big or dominant or monopolies or duopolies like Google or Microsoft or whatever. And instead of attacking them head on, you might have two kind of what I call resegmenting strategies. You might go for a niche, a segment of them, or you might decide, you know, I could deliver 80% of the features at 20% of the price. You know, I could in fact be a low-cost provider. Get it made in China, or kind of de-feature them. That's still going after an existing market. What you described is what I call a new market. You use the Clinton Christensen phrase, disruptive. But in a new market, what do we know about the market? What's the size of the market? What's in fact the revenue curve going to look like? Classic hockey stick, and you're praying for the stick. Right? And in fact, the only time that stick happens, that tipping point, is if your hypothesis about what's required is correct. You're making a much different bet than anybody else in the room who's decided to go into an existing or resegmented market. What type of investors do you need in a new market? Brave ones. Who in fact want to invest in disruptive markets because when they do tip, if they do, are large and huge and really interesting. So the first question you need to ask is, do any people who write checks believe what I believe? And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It just means, uh-oh, I can't get any funding to do what I need. Or do people share your vision? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And you want to be able to articulate how long it's going to take and what are the requirements for that market to tip. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
For all of you, here's the weird part. A lot of startups go out of business selling that they're an existing market to investors, but are actually in new markets, right? And in fact, get no revenue in a couple of years and actually run out of money because, you know, their investors were expecting revenue when you kind of knew, you know, there are really no customers now. So unfortunately, you don't get a memo that says what market type you're in. You should always be asking yourself, you know, which one? Because it'll screw up your spending. The other thing, the other mistake you could make, when you're in an existing market, what do you do about sales and marketing in year one? What do you do?
Research.
I'm sorry?
Research?
No. You launch like there's no tomorrow. Why? What do you know about the market? It's there. It's your job to take it. You're hiring sales, you're spending money, and we're betting that your assumptions about what you did in customer discovery are right. Now imagine you had the exact same thing, but you're in a new market. When do you hire sales and marketing?
No.
You don't. Not until you understand this thing's about to tip. That's why a lot of startups burn a lot of cash at the wrong time. If you think you're in a new market and you're hiring sales and marketing in day one, you're already out of business, my friend. It's a big idea, not understanding that distinction. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Wasn't even the question you asked, but all right. Well, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.